I should suppose so, sir, for hostile tribes would hardly remain anywhere near the districts under the British rule. That will complicate our search, said Glenarvan, somewhat disconcerted. How can we possibly find traces of the captives in the heart of so vast a continent? No one replied, though Lady Helena's questioning glances at her companions seemed to press for an answer. Paganel even was silent. His ingenuity for once was at fault. John Mangles paced the cabin with great strides, as if he fancied himself on the deck of his ship, evidently quite nonplussed. "And you, Mr. Ayrton," said Lady Helena at last, "what would you do?" "Madam," replied Ayrton, readily enough, "I should re-embark in the Duncan, and go right to the scene of the catastrophe. There I should be guided by circumstances, and by any chance indications we might discover." "Very good," returned Glenarvan, "but we must wait till the Duncan is repaired." "Ah, she has been injured then," said Ayrton. "Yes," replied Mangles. "To any serious extent?" "No, but such injuries as require more skillful workmanship than we have on board. One of the branches of the screw is twisted, and we cannot get it repaired nearer than Melbourne." "Well, let the ship go to Melbourne then," said Paganel, "and we will go without her to Twofold Bay." "And how?" asked Mangles. "By crossing Australia as we crossed America, keeping along the 37th parallel." "But the Duncan," repeated Ayrton, as if particularly anxious on that score. "The Duncan can rejoin us, or we can rejoin her, as the case may be. Should we discover Captain Grant in the course of our journey, we can all return together to Melbourne. If we have to go on to the coast, on the contrary, then the Duncan can come to us there. Who has any objection to make? Have you, Major?" "No, not if there is a practicable route across Australia." "So practicable that I propose Lady Helena and Miss Grant should accompany us." "Are you speaking seriously?" asked Glenarvan. "Perfectly so, my lord. It is a journey of 350 miles, not more. If we go 12 miles a day, it will barely take us a month, just long enough to put the vessel in trim. If we had to cross the continent in a lower latitude, at its wildest part, and traverse immense deserts, where there is no water and where the heat is tropical, and go where the most adventurous travelers have never yet ventured, that would be a different matter. But the 37th parallel cuts only through the province of Victoria, quite an English country, with roads and railways, and well populated almost everywhere. It is a journey you might make, almost in a chaise, though a wagon would be better. It is a mere trip from London to Edinburgh, nothing more." "What about wild beasts, though?" asked Glenarvan, anxious to go into all the difficulties of the proposal. "There are no wild beasts in Australia." "And how about the savages?" "There are no savages in this latitude, and if there were, they are not cruel like the New Zealanders." "And the convicts?" "There are no convicts in the southern provinces, only in the eastern colonies. The province of Victoria not only refused to admit them, but passed a law to prevent any ticket-of-leave men from other provinces from entering her territories. This very year the government threatened to withdraw its subsidy from the Peninsular Company if their vessels continued to take in coal in those western parts of Australia where convicts are admitted. What? Don't you know that, and you an Englishman?" "In the first place, I beg leave to say I am not an Englishman," replied Glenarvan. "What M. Paganel says is perfectly correct," said Paddy O'Moore. "Not only the province of Victoria, but also southern Australia, Queensland, and even Tasmania have agreed to expel convicts from their territories. Ever since I have been on this farm, I have never heard of one in this province. And I can speak for myself, I have never come across one." "You see then, friends," went on Jacques Paganel, "there are few if any savages, no ferocious animals, no convicts, and there are not many countries of Europe for which you can say as much. Well, will you go?" "What do you think, Helena?" asked Glenarvan. "What we all think, dear Edward," replied Lady Helena, turning toward her companions. "Let us be off at once." Chapter 8: Preparation for the Journey. Glenarvan never lost much time between adopting an idea and carrying it out. As soon as he consented to Paganel's proposition, he gave immediate orders to make arrangements for the journey with as little delay as possible. The time of starting was fixed for the 22nd of December, the next day but one. What results might not come out of this journey? The presence of Harry Grant had become an indisputable fact, and the chances of finding him had increased. Not that anyone expected to discover the captain exactly on the 37th parallel, which they intended strictly to follow, but they might come upon his track, and at all events, they were going to the actual spot where the wreck had occurred. That was the principal point. Besides, if Ayrton consented to join them and act as their guide through the forests of the province of Victoria and right to the eastern coast, they would have a fresh chance of success. Glenarvan was sensible of this, and asked his host whether he would have any great objection to his asking Ayrton to accompany them, for he felt particularly desirous of securing the assistance of Harry Grant's old companion. Paddy O'Moore consented, though he would regret the loss of his excellent servant. "Well then, Ayrton, will you come with us in our search expedition?" Ayrton did not reply immediately. He even showed signs of hesitation, but at last, after due reflection, said, "Yes, my lord, I will go with you, and if I cannot take you to Captain Grant, I can at least take you to the very place where his ship struck." "Thanks, Ayrton. One question, my lord." "Well, where will you meet the Duncan again?" "At Melbourne, unless we traverse the whole continent from coast to coast." "But the captain—" "The captain will await my instructions in the port of Melbourne." "You may depend on me then, my lord." "I will, Ayrton." The quartermaster was warmly thanked by the passengers of the Duncan, and the children loaded him with caresses. Everyone rejoiced in his decision except the Irishman, who lost in him an intelligent and faithful helper. But Paddy understood the importance Glenarvan attached to the presence of the man, and submitted. The whole party then returned to the ship, after arranging a rendezvous with Ayrton and ordering him to procure the necessary means of conveyance across the country. When John Mangles supported the proposition of Paganel, he took for granted that he should accompany the expedition. He began to speak to Glenarvan at once about it, and adduced all sorts of arguments to advance his cause: his devotion to Lady Helena and his lordship, how useful could he be in organizing the party, and how useless on board the Duncan. Everything, in fact, but the main reason, and that he had no need to bring forward. "I'll only ask you one question, John," said Glenarvan. "Have you entire confidence in your chief officer?" "Absolute," replied Mangles. "Tom Austin is a good sailor. He will take the ship to her destination, see that the repairs are skillfully executed, and bring her back on the appointed day. Tom is a slave to duty and discipline. Never would he take it upon himself to alter or retard the execution of an order. Your lordship may rely on him as on myself." "Very well then, John," replied Glenarvan. "You shall go with us, for it would be advisable," he added, smiling, "that you should be there when we find Mary Grant's father." "Oh, your lordship," murmured John, turning pale. He could say no more, but grasped Lord Glenarvan's hand. Next day, John Mangles and the ship's carpenter, accompanied by sailors carrying provisions, went back to Paddy O'Moore's house to consult the Irishman about the best method of transport. All the family met him, ready to give their best help. Ayrton was there, and gave the benefit of his experience. On one point both he and Paddy agreed, that the journey should be made in a bullock wagon by the ladies, and that the gentlemen should ride on horseback. Paddy could furnish both bullocks and vehicle. The vehicle was a cart 20 feet long, covered over by a tilt, and resting on 4 large wheels without spokes or felloes or iron tires, in a word, plain wooden discs. The front and hinder part were connected by means of a rude mechanical contrivance, which did not allow of the vehicle turning quickly. There was a pole in front 35 feet long, to which the bullocks were to be yoked in couples. These animals were able to draw both with head and neck, as their yoke was fastened on the nape of the neck, and to this a collar was attached by an iron peg. It required great skill to drive such a long, narrow, shaky concern, and to guide such a team by a goad. But Ayrton had served his apprenticeship to it on the Irishman's farm, and Paddy could answer for his competency. The role of conductor was therefore assigned to him. There were no springs to the wagon, and, consequently, it was not likely to be very comfortable. But, such as it was, they had to take it. But if the rough construction could not be altered, John Mangles resolved that the interior should be made as easy as possible. His first care was to divide it into 2 compartments by a wooden partition. The back one was intended for the provisions and luggage, and M. Albinet's portable kitchen. The front was set apart especially for the ladies, and, under the carpenter's hands, was to be speedily converted into a comfortable room, covered with a thick carpet, and fitted up with a toilet table and 2 couches. Thick leather curtains shut in this apartment, and protected the occupants from the chilliness of the nights. In case of necessity, the gentlemen might shelter themselves here when the violent rains came on, but a tent was to be their usual resting place when the caravan camped for the night. John Mangles exercised all his ingenuity in furnishing the small space with everything that the two ladies could possibly require, and he succeeded so well that neither Lady Helena nor Mary had much reason to regret leaving their cozy cabins on board the Duncan. For the rest of the party, the preparations were soon made, for they needed much less. Strong horses were provided for Lord Glenarvan, Paganel, Robert Grant, McNabbs, and John Mangles, also for the two sailors, Wilson and Mulready, who were to accompany their captain. Ayrton's place was, of course, to be in front of the wagon, and M. Albinett, who did not much care for equitation, was to make room for himself among the baggage. Horses and bullocks were grazing in the Irishman's meadows, ready to fetch at a moment's notice. After all arrangements were made, and the carpenter set to work, John Mangles escorted the Irishman and his family back to the vessel, for Paddy wished to return the visit of Lord Glenarvan. Ayrton thought proper to go too, and about 4 o'clock the party came over the side of the Duncan. They were received with open arms. Glenarvan would not be outstripped in politeness, and invited his visitors to stop and dine. His hospitality was willingly accepted. Paddy was quite amazed at the splendor of the saloon, and was loud in admiration of the fitting up of the cabins, and the carpets and hangings, as well as of the polished maplewood of the upper deck. Ayrton's approbation was much less hearty, for he considered it mere costly superfluity. But when he examined the yacht with a sailor's eye, the quartermaster of the Britannia was as enthusiastic about it as Paddy. He went down into the hold, inspected the screw department and the engine room, examining the engine thoroughly, and inquired about its power and consumption. He explored the coal bunkers, the storeroom, the powder store, and armory, in which last he seemed to be particularly attracted by a cannon mounted on the forecastle. Glenarvan saw he had to do with a man who understood such matters, as was evident from his questions. Ayrton concluded his investigations by a survey of the masts and rigging. "You have a fine vessel, my lord," he said after his curiosity was satisfied. "A good one, and that is best," replied Glenarvan. "And what is her tonnage?" 210 tons. "I don't think I am far out," continued Ayrton, "in judging her speed at 15 knots. I should say she could do that easily." "Say 17, put in John Mangles, and you've hit the mark." 17, exclaimed the quartermaster. "Why, not a man-o'-war, not the best among them, I mean, could chase her." "Not one," replied Mangles. "The Duncan is a regular racing yacht, and would never let herself be beaten." "Even at sailing?" asked Ayrton. "Even at sailing." "Well, my lord, and you too, captain," returned Ayrton, "allow a sailor who knows what a ship is worth to compliment you on yours." "Stay on board of her, then, Ayrton," said Glenarvan. "It rests with yourself to call it yours." "I will think of it, my lord," was all Ayrton's reply. Just then M. Albinett came to announce dinner, and his lordship repaired with his guests to the saloon. "That Ayrton is an intelligent man," said Paganel to the major. "Too intelligent," muttered McNabbs, who, without any apparent reason, had taken a great dislike to the face and manners of the quartermaster. During the dinner, Ayrton gave some interesting details about the Australian continent, which he knew perfectly. He asked how many sailors were going to accompany the expedition, and seemed astonished to hear that only 2 were going. He advised Glenarvan to take all his best men, and even urged him to do it, which advice, by the way, ought to have removed the major's suspicion. "But," said Glenarvan, "our journey is not dangerous, is it?" "Not at all," replied Ayrton quickly. "Well then, we'll have all the men we can on board. Hands will be wanted to work the ship, and to help in the repairs. Besides, it is of the utmost importance that she should meet us to the very day, at whatever place may be ultimately selected. Consequently, we must not lessen her crew." Ayrton said nothing more, as if convinced his lordship was right. When evening came, Scotch and Irish separated. Ayrton and Paddy O'Moore family returned home. Horses and wagons were to be ready the next day, and 8 o'clock in the morning was fixed for starting. Lady Helena and Mary Grant soon made their preparations. They had less to do than Jacques Paganel, for he spent half the night in arranging, and wiping, and rubbing up the lenses of his telescope. Of course, next morning he slept on till the major's stentorian voice roused him. The luggage was already conveyed to the farm, thanks to John Mangles, and a boat was waiting to take the passengers. They were soon seated, and the young captain gave his final orders to Tom Austin, his chief officer. He impressed upon him that he was to wait at Melbourne for Lord Glenarvan's commands, and to obey them scrupulously, whatever they might be. The old sailor told John he might rely on him, and, in the name of the men, begged to offer his lordship their best wishes for the success of this new expedition. A storm of hurrahs burst forth from the yacht as the boat rowed off. In 10 minutes the shore was reached, and a quarter of an hour afterward the Irishman's farm. All was ready. Lady Helena was enchanted with her installation. The huge chariot with its primitive wheels and massive planks pleased her particularly. The 6 bullocks, yoked in pairs, had a patriarchal air about them which took her fancy. Ayrton, goad in hand, stood waiting the orders of this new master. "My word," said Paganel, "this is a famous vehicle. It beats all the mail coaches in the world. I don't know a better fashion of traveling than in a mountebank's caravan, a movable house which goes or stops wherever you please. What can one wish better?" The Samaratians understood that, and never traveled in any other way. "Monsieur Paganel," said Lady Helena, "I hope I shall have the pleasure of seeing you in my salons." "Assuredly, madam, I should count it an honor. Have you fixed the day?" "I shall be at home every day to my friends," replied Lady Helena, "and you are." "The most devoted among them all," interrupted Paganel gaily. These mutual compliments were interrupted by the arrival of the 7 horses, saddled and ready. They were brought by Paddy's sons, and Lord Glenarvan paid the sum stipulated for his various purchases, adding his cordial thanks, which the worthy Irishman valued at least as much as his golden guineas. The signal was given to start, and Lady Helena and Mary took their places in the reserved compartment. Ayrton seated himself in front, and Albinett scrambled in among the luggage. The rest of the party, well armed with carbines and revolvers, mounted their horses. Ayrton gave a peculiar cry, and his team set off. The wagon shook and the planks creaked, and the axles grated in the naves of the wheels, and before long the hospitable farm of the Irishman was out of sight. Chapter 9: A Country of Paradoxes. It was the 23rd of December, 1864, a dull, damp, dreary month in the northern hemisphere, but on the Australian continent it might be called June. The hottest season of the year had already commenced, and the sun's rays were almost tropical, when Lord Glenarvan started on his new expedition. Most fortunately, the 37th parallel did not cross the immense deserts, inaccessible regions, which have cost many martyrs to science already. Glenarvan could never have encountered them. He had only to do with the southern part of Australia, viz., with a narrow portion of the province of Adelaide, with the whole of Victoria, and with the top of the reversed triangle which forms New South Wales. It is scarcely 62 miles from Cape Bernouilli to the frontiers of Victoria. It was not above a 2 days' march, and Ayrton reckoned on their sleeping next night at Apsley, the most westerly town of Victoria. The commencement of a journey is always marked by ardor, both in the horses and the horsemen. This is well enough in the horsemen, but if the horses are to go far, their speed must be moderated and their strength husbanded. It was, therefore, fixed that the average journey every day should not be more than from 25 to 30 miles. Besides, the pace of the horses must be regulated by the slower pace of the bullocks, truly mechanical engines which lose in time what they gain in power. The wagon, with its passengers and provisions, was the very center of the caravan, the moving fortress. The horsemen might act as scouts but must never be far away from it. As no special marching order had been agreed upon, everybody was at liberty to follow his inclinations within certain limits. The hunters could scour the plain, amiable folks could talk to the fair occupants of the wagon, and philosophers could philosophize. Paganel, who was all three combined, had to be and was everywhere at once. The march across Adelaide presented nothing of any particular interest. A succession of low hills rich in dust, a long stretch of what they call in Australia bush, several prairies covered with a small prickly bush, considered a great dainty by the ovine tribe, embraced many miles. Here and there they noticed a species of sheep peculiar to New Holland, sheep with pigs' heads, feeding between the posts of the telegraph line recently made between Adelaide and the coast. Up to this time there had been a singular resemblance in the country to the monotonous plains of the Argentine pampas. There was the same grassy flat soil, the same sharply defined horizon against the sky. McNabbs declared they had never changed countries, but Paganel told him to wait, and he would soon see a difference. And on the faith of this assurance, marvelous things were expected by the whole party. In this fashion, after a march of 60 miles in 2 days, the caravan reached the parish of Apsley, the first town in the province of Victoria in the Wimmera district. The wagon was put up at the Crown Inn. Supper was soon smoking on the table. It consisted solely of mutton served up in various ways. They all ate heartily, but talked more than they ate, eagerly asking Paganel questions about the wonders of the country they were just beginning to traverse. The amiable geographer needed no pressing, and told them first that this part of it was called Australia Felix. Wrongly named, he continued. It had better have been called rich, for it is true of countries, as individuals, that riches do not make happiness. Thanks to her gold mines, Australia has been abandoned to wild, devastating adventurers. You will come across them when we reach the gold fields. Is not the colony of Victoria of but a recent origin? Asked Lady Glenarvan. Yes, madam, it only numbers 30 years of existence. It was on the 6th of June, 1835, on a Tuesday. At 7:15 in the evening, put in the Major, who delighted in teasing the Frenchman about his precise dates. No, at 7:10, replied the geographer gravely, that Batman and Falkner first began a settlement at Port Phillip, the bay on which the large city of Melbourne now stands. For 15 years the colony was part of New South Wales and recognized Sydney as the capital, but in 1851 she was declared independent and took the name of Victoria. And has greatly increased in prosperity since then, I believe, said Glenarvan. Judge for yourself, my noble friend, replied Paganel. Here are the numbers given by the last statistics, and let McNabb say as he likes, I know nothing more eloquent than statistics. Go on, said the Major. Well then, in 1836, the colony of Port Phillip had inhabitants. Today the province of Victoria numbers 550,000. 7 millions of vines produce annually 121,000 gallons of wine. There are 103,000 horses spreading over the plains, and 272 horned cattle graze in her wide-stretching pastures. Is there not also a certain number of pigs? Inquired McNabbs. Yes, Major, 79,625. And how many sheep? 7,115,943, McNabbs. Including the one we are eating at this moment. No, without counting that, since it is 3 parts devoured. Bravo, Monsieur Paganel, exclaimed Lady Helena, laughing heartily. It must be owned you are posted up in geographical questions, and my cousin McNabbs need not try and find you tripping. It is my calling, madam, to know this sort of thing, and to give you the benefit of my information when you please. You may therefore believe me when I tell you that wonderful things are in store for you in this strange country. It does not look like it at present, said McNabbs, on purpose to tease Paganel. Just wait, impatient Major, was his rejoinder. You have hardly put your foot on the frontier when you turn round and abuse it. Well, I say and say again, and will always maintain that this is the most curious country on the earth. Its formation and nature and products and climate, and even its future disappearance have amazed, and are now amazing, and will amaze, all the savants in the world. Think, my friends, of a continent, the margin of which, instead of the center, rose out of the waves originally like a gigantic ring, which encloses, perhaps in its center, a sea partly evaporated, the waves of which are drying up daily, where humidity does not exist either in the air or in the soil, where the trees lose their bark every year instead of their leaves, where the leaves present their sides to the sun and not their face and consequently give no shade, where the wood is often incombustible, where good-sized stones are dissolved by the rain, where the forests are low and the grass is gigantic, where the animals are strange, where quadrupeds have beaks like the echidna or ornithorhynchus, and naturalists have been obliged to create a special order for them, called monotremes, where the kangaroos leap on unequal legs and sheep have pigs' heads, where foxes fly about from tree to tree, where the swans are black, where rats make nests, where the bowerbird opens her reception rooms to receive visits from her feathered friends, where the birds astonish the imagination by the variety of their notes and their aptness, where one bird serves for a clock, and another makes a sound like a postillion cracking of a whip, and a third imitates a knife grinder, and a fourth the motion of a pendulum, where one laughs when the sun rises, and another cries when the sun sets. Oh, strange, illogical country, land of paradoxes and anomalies, if ever there was one on earth. The learned botanist Grimard was right when he said, there is that Australia, a sort of parody, or rather a defiance of universal laws in the face of the rest of the world. Paganel's tirade was poured forth in the most impetuous manner, and seemed as if it were never coming to an end. The eloquent secretary of the Geographical Society was no longer master of himself. He went on and on, gesticulating furiously and brandishing his fork to the imminent danger of his neighbors. But at last his voice was drowned in a thunder of applause, and he managed to stop. Certainly, after such an enumeration of Australian peculiarities, he might have been left in peace, but the Major said in the coolest tone possible, "And is that all, Paganel?" "No, indeed not," rejoined the Frenchman with renewed vehemence. "What?" exclaimed Lady Helena. "There are more wonders still in Australia." "Yes, madam, its climate, it is even stranger than its productions." "Is it possible?" they all said. "I am not speaking of the hygienic qualities of the climate," continued Paganel, "rich as it is in oxygen and poor in azote. There are no damp winds because the trade winds blow regularly on the coasts, and most diseases are unknown, from typhus to measles and chronic affections." "Still, that is no small advantage," said Glenarvan. "No doubt, but I am not referring to that, but to one quality it has which is incomparable." "And what is that?" "You will never believe me." "Yes, we will," exclaimed his auditors, their curiosity aroused by this preamble. "Well, it is." "It is what?" "It is a moral regeneration." "A moral regeneration." "Yes," replied the savant, in a tone of conviction. "Here metals do not get rust on them by exposure to the air, nor men. Here the pure, dry atmosphere whitens everything rapidly, both linen and souls. The virtue of the climate must have been well known in England when they determined to send their criminals here to be reformed." "What, do you mean to say the climate has really any such influence?" said Lady Helena. "Yes, madam, both on animals and men." "You are not joking, Monsieur Paganel." "I am not, madam. The horses and the cattle here are of incomparable docility, you see it." "It is impossible." "But it is a fact, and the convicts transported into this reviving, salubrious air become regenerated in a few years. Philanthropists know this. In Australia all natures grow better." "But what is to become of you then, Monsieur Paganel, in this privileged country, you who are so good already?" said Lady Helena. "What will you turn out?" "Excellent, madam, just excellent, and that's all." Chapter 10: An Accident. The next day, the 24th of December, they started at daybreak. The heat was already considerable, but not unbearable, and the road was smooth and good, and allowed the cavalcade to make speedy progress. In the evening they camped on the banks of the White Lake, the waters of which are brackish and undrinkable. Jacques Paganel was obliged to own that the name of this lake was a complete misnomer, for the waters were no more white than the Black Sea is black, or the Red Sea red, or the Yellow River yellow, or the Blue Mountains blue. However, he argued and disputed the point with all the amour propre of a geographer, but his reasoning made no impression. Albinet prepared the evening meal with his accustomed punctuality, and after this was dispatched, the travelers disposed themselves for the night in the wagon and in the tent, and were soon sleeping soundly, notwithstanding the melancholy howling of the dingoes, the jackals of Australia. A magnificent plain, thickly covered with chrysanthemums, stretched out beyond the lake, and Glenarvan and his friends would gladly have explored its beauties when they awoke next morning, but they had to start. As far as the eye could reach, nothing was visible but one stretch of prairie, enameled with flower in all the freshness and abundance of spring. The blue flowers of the slender-leaved flax combined with the bright hues of the scarlet acanthus, a flower peculiar to the country. A few cassowaries were bounding over the plain, but it was impossible to get near them. The Major was fortunate enough, however, to hit one very rare animal with a ball in the leg. This was the jabiru, a species which is fast disappearing, the gigantic crane of the English colonies. This winged creature was 5 feet high, and his wide, conical, extremely pointed beak measured 18 inches in length. The violet and purple tints of his head contrasted vividly with the glossy green of his neck, and the dazzling whiteness of his throat, and the bright red of his long legs. Nature seems to have exhausted in its favor all the primitive colors on her palette. Great admiration was bestowed on this bird, and the Major's spoil would have borne the honors of the day, had not Robert come across an animal a few miles further on, and bravely killed it. It was a shapeless creature, half porcupine, half anteater, a sort of unfinished animal belonging to the first stage of creation. A long, glutinous, extensible tongue hung out of his jaws in search of the ants, which formed its principal food. "It is an echidna," said Paganel. "Have you ever seen such a creature?" "It is horrible," replied Glenarvan. "Horrible enough, but curious, and, what's more, peculiar to Australia. One might search for it in vain in any other part of the world." Naturally enough, the geographer wished to preserve this interesting specimen of Monotremata, and wanted to stow it away in the luggage. But M. Albinett resented the idea so indignantly that the savant was obliged to abandon his project. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, John Mangles descried an enormous column of smoke about 3 miles off, gradually overspreading the whole horizon. What could be the cause of this phenomenon? Paganel was inclined to think it was some description of meteor, and his lively imagination was already in search of an explanation, when Ayrton cut short all his conjectures summarily, by announcing that the cloud of dust was caused by a drove of cattle on the road. The quartermaster proved right, for as the cloud came nearer, quite a chorus of bleatings and neighings, and bell-lowings escaped from it, mingled with the loud tones of a human voice, in the shape of cries and whistles and vociferations. Presently a man came out of the cloud. This was the leader-in-chief of the four-footed army. Glenarvan advanced toward him, and friendly relations were speedily established between them. The leader, or to give him his proper designation, the stock-keeper, was part owner of the drove. His name was Sam Mashell, and he was on his way from the eastern provinces to Portland Bay. The drove number, 75 head in all, or L, 0 bullocks, 11,000 sheep and horses. All these had been bought in the Blue Mountains in a poor, lean condition, and were going to be fatted up on the rich pasture lands of southern Australia and sold again at a great profit. Sam Mashell expected to get £2 on each bullock and on every sheep, which would bring him in £37.50. This was doing good business, but what patience and energy were required to conduct such a restive, stubborn lot to their destination, and what fatigues must have to be endured. Truly the gain was hardly earned. Sam Mashell told his history in a few words, while the drove continued their march among the groves of mimosas. Lady Helena and Mary and the rest of the party seated themselves under the shade of a wide-spreading gum tree and listened to his recital. It was 7 months since Sam Mashell had started. He had gone at the rate of 10 miles a day, and his interminable journey would last 3 months longer. His assistants in the laborious task comprised 20 dogs and 30 men, 5 of whom were blacks, and very serviceable in tracking up any strayed beasts. 6 wagons made the rear guard. All the men were armed with stock whips, the handles of which are 18 inches long, and the lash 9 feet, and they move about among the ranks, bringing refractory animals back into order, while the dogs, the light cavalry of the regiment, preserved discipline in the wings. The travelers were struck with the admirable arrangement of the drove. The different stock were kept apart, for wild sheep and bullocks would not have got on together at all. The bullocks would never have grazed where the sheep had passed along, and consequently they had to go first, divided into 2 battalions. 5 regiments of sheep followed, in charge of 20 men, and last of all came the horses. Sam Mashell drew the attention of his auditors to the fact that the real guides of the drove were neither the men nor the dogs, but the oxen themselves, beasts of superior intelligence, recognized as leaders by their congenitors. They advanced in front with perfect gravity, choosing the best route by instinct, and fully alive to their claim to respect. Indeed, they were obliged to be studied and humored in everything, for the whole drove obeyed them implicitly. If they took it into their heads to stop, it was a matter of necessity to yield to their good pleasure, for not a single animal would move a step till these leaders gave the signal to set off. Sundry details, added by the stock-keeper, completed the history of this expedition, worthy of being written, if not commended by Xenophon himself. As long as the troop marched over the plains it was well enough, there was little difficulty or fatigue. The animals fed as they went along, and slaked their thirst at the numerous creeks that watered the plains, sleeping at night and making good progress in the day, always obedient and tractable to the dogs. But when they had to go through great forests and groves of eucalyptus and mimosas, the difficulties increased. Platoons, battalions, and regiments got all mixed together or scattered, and it was a work of time to collect them again. Should a leader unfortunately go astray, he had to be found, cost what it might, on pain of a general disbandment, and the blacks were often long days in quest of him, before their search was successful. During the heavy rains the lazy beasts refused to stir, and when violent storms chanced to occur, The creatures became almost mad with terror and were seized with a wild, disorderly panic. However, by dint of energy and ambition, the stockkeeper triumphed over these difficulties, incessantly renewed though they were. He kept steadily on, mile after mile of plains and woods and mountains lay behind. But in addition to all his other qualities, there was one higher than all that he specially needed when they came to rivers. This was patience, patience that could stand any trial, and not only could hold out for hours and days, but for weeks. The stockkeeper would be himself forced to wait on the banks of a stream that might have been crossed at once. There was nothing to hinder but the obstinacy of the herd. The bullocks would taste the water and turn back. The sheep fled in all directions, afraid to brave the liquid element. The stockkeeper hoped when night came he might manage them better, but they still refused to go forward. The rams were dragged in by force, but the sheep would not follow. They tried what thirst would do, by keeping them without drink for several days, but when they were brought to the river again, they simply quenched their thirst and declined a more intimate acquaintance with the water. The next expedient employed was to carry all the lambs over, hoping the mothers would be drawn after them, moved by their cries. But the lambs might bleat as pitifully as they liked, the mothers never stirred. Sometimes this state of affairs would last a whole month, and the stockkeeper would be driven to his wits' end by his bleating, bellowing, neighing army. Then all of a sudden, one fine day, without rhyme or reason, a detachment would take it into their heads to make a start across, and the only difficulty now was to keep the whole herd from rushing helter-skelter after them. The wildest confusion set in among the ranks, and numbers of the animals were drowned in the passage. Such was the narrative of Sam Mashell. During its recital, a considerable part of the troop had filed past in good order. It was time for him to return to his place at their head, that he might be able to choose the best pasturage. Taking leave of Lord Glenarvan, he sprang on a capital horse of the native breed, that one of his men held waiting for him, and after shaking hands cordially with everybody all round, took his departure. A few minutes later, nothing was visible of the stockkeeper and his troop but a cloud of dust. The wagon resumed its course in the opposite direction, and did not stop again till they halted for the night at the foot of Mount Talbot. Paganel made the judicious observation that it was the 25th of December, the Christmas day so dear to English hearts. But the steward had not forgotten it, and an appetizing meal was soon ready under the tent, for which he deserved and received warm compliments from the guests. Indeed, M. Albonnet had quite excelled himself on this occasion. He produced from his stores such an array of European dishes as is seldom seen in the Australian desert. Reindeer hams, slices of salt beef, smoked salmon, oat cakes and barley meal scones, tea ad libitum and whiskey in abundance, and several bottles of port composed this astonishing meal. The little party might have thought themselves in the grand dining hall of Malcolm Castle, in the heart of the Highlands of Scotland. The next day, at 11 a.m., the wagon reached the banks of the Wimmera on the 143d meridian. The river, half a mile in width, wound its limpid course between tall rows of gum trees and acacias. Magnificent specimens of the Myotaceae, among others, the Metrosydrose speciosa, 15 feet high, with long drooping branches, adorned with red flowers. Thousands of birds, the lories and greenfinches and gold-winged pigeons, not to speak of the noisy paroquets, flew about in the green branches. Below, on the bosom of the water, were a couple of shy and unapproachable black swans. This rara avis of the Australian rivers soon disappeared among the windings of the Wimmera, which water the charming landscape in the most capricious manner. The wagon stopped on a grassy bank, the long fringes of which dipped in the rapid current. There was neither raft nor bridge, but cross over they must. Ayrton looked about for a practicable ford. About a quarter of a mile up the water seemed shallower, and it was here they determined to try to pass over. The soundings in different parts showed a depth of 3 feet only, so that the wagon might safely enough venture. "I suppose there is no other way of fording the river?" said Glenarvan to the quartermaster. "No, my lord, but the passage does not seem dangerous. We shall manage it." "Shall Lady Glenarvan and Miss Grant get out of the wagon?" "Not at all. My bullocks are sure-footed, and you may rely on me for keeping them straight." "Very well, Ayrton, I can trust you." The horsemen surrounded the ponderous vehicle, and all stepped boldly into the current. Generally, when wagons have to ford rivers, they have empty casks slung all round them, to keep them floating on the water. But they had no such swimming belt with them on this occasion, and they could only depend on the sagacity of the animals and the prudence of Ayrton, who directed the team. The major and the 2 sailors were some feet in advance. Glenarvan and John Mangles went at the sides of the wagon, ready to lend any assistance the fair travelers might require, and Paganel and Robert brought up the rear. All went well till they reached the middle of the Wimmera, but then the hollow deepened, and the water rose to the middle of the wheels. The bullocks were in danger of losing their footing and dragging with them the oscillating vehicle. Ayrton devoted himself to his task courageously. He jumped into the water and, hanging on by the bullocks' horns, dragged them back into the right course. Suddenly, the wagon made a jolt that it was impossible to prevent. A crack was heard, and the vehicle began to lean over in a most precarious manner. The water now rose to the lady's feet. The whole concern began to float, though John Mangles and Lord Glenarvan hung on to the side. It was an anxious moment. Fortunately, a vigorous effort drove the wagon toward the opposite shore, and the bank began to slope upward, so that the horses and bullocks were able to regain their footing, and soon the whole party found themselves on the other side, glad enough, though wet enough too. The forepart of the wagon, however, was broken by the jolt, and Glenarvan's horse had lost a shoe. This was an accident that needed to be promptly repaired. They looked at each other, hardly knowing what to do, till Ayrton proposed he should go to Black Point Station, 20 miles further north, and bring back a blacksmith with him. "Yes, go, my good fellow," said Glenarvan. "How long will it take you to get there and back?" "About 15 hours," replied Ayrton, "but not longer." "Start at once, then, and we will camp here, on the banks of the Wimmera, till you return." Chapter 11: Crime or Calamity. It was not without apprehension that the Major saw Ayrton quit the Wimmera camp to go and look for a blacksmith at the Black Point Station. But he did not breathe a word of his private misgivings, and contented himself with watching the neighborhood of the river. Nothing disturbed the repose of those tranquil glades, and after a short night, the sun reappeared on the horizon. As to Glenarvan, his only fear was lest Ayrton should return alone. If they failed to find a workman, the wagon could not resume the journey. This might end in a delay of many days, and Glenarvan, impatient to succeed, could brook no delay in his eagerness to attain his object. Ayrton luckily had lost neither his time nor his trouble. He appeared next morning at daybreak, accompanied by a man who gave himself out as the blacksmith from Black Point Station. He was a powerful fellow and tall, but his features were of a low, brutal type, which did not prepossess anyone in his favor. But that was nothing, provided he knew his business. He scarcely spoke, and certainly he did not waste his breath in useless words. "Is he a good workman?" said John Mangles to the quartermaster. "I know no more about him than you do, Captain," said Ayrton, "but we shall see." The blacksmith set to work. Evidently that was his trade, as they could plainly see from the way he set about repairing the forepart of the wagon. He worked skillfully and with uncommon energy. The Major observed that the flesh of his wrists was deeply furrowed, showing a ring of extravasated blood. It was the mark of a recent injury, which the sleeve of an old woolen shirt could not conceal. McNabbs questioned the blacksmith about those sores which looked so painful. The man continued his work without answering. 2 hours more and the damage the carriage had sustained was made good. As to Glenarvan's horse, it was soon disposed of. The blacksmith had had the forethought to bring the shoes with him. These shoes had a peculiarity which did not escape the Major. It was a trefoil clumsily cut on the back part. McNabbs pointed it out to Ayrton. "It is the Black Point brand," said the quartermaster. "That enables them to track any horses that may stray from the station and prevents their being mixed with other herds." The horse was soon shod. The blacksmith claimed his wage and went off without uttering 4 words. Half an hour later, the travelers were on the road. Beyond the grove of mimosas was a stretch of sparsely timbered country, which quite deserved its name of open plain. Some fragments of quartz and ferruginous rock lay among the scrub and the tall grass, where numerous flocks were feeding. Some miles farther, the wheels of the wagon plowed deep into the alluvial soil, where irregular creeks murmured in their beds, half hidden among giant reeds. By and by they skirted vast salt lakes, rapidly evaporating. The journey was accomplished without trouble, and, indeed, without fatigue.